All right. So I left off last time that we got together, and we were talking about motivation, right? Now, motivation is very important when it comes to understanding mental health. You know, we're shifting gears. If you notice, we're moving away from more of the sciencey stuff like the brain and the neurotransmitters and the biological senses, and we're moving more into the sphere of psychology and mental health and the development of personalities. So these are some really important topics that we're covering when we get into mental health. So motivation is a big part of it. As I talked to you last time, motivation is really what drives us to do things better or improve our lives, right? And some people might be motivated to doing things that aren't so good in their lives, right? And that could be dangerous. But nonetheless, when we look at motivation, we look at their willingness and their ability to kind of stick it through and do what they need to do to either get help for themselves or their family or whatever, right? The other side of that, and this kind of goes along with motivation, is the development of emotions, right? When our emotions, we have varying emotions within our minds, within our grasp, and sometimes it's not always easy to identify what emotions we're feeling, right? And we'll get into that probably next week as we talk more about this stuff. But emotions, I work with a lot of people in regards to anger management. As I used to do that in the military, and it's a very unique perspective because I get a lot of people that come in and they wonder why they can't control their anger, quote unquote. I need to control my anger. That's a very, very hard thing to do. People can't control their emotions. They can control how they respond to the emotions, but they can't control the emotions themselves, which kind of sets them up for failure. So anyway, that's like the first thing I share with people when they come in the door. We can't control our anger. We can control how we react to that, and that takes a lot of time and a lot of practice. Okay, so just my own little spin on emotions. All right, but nonetheless, all creatures in the animal kingdom, we exhibit some certain type of behavior, but really only a small portion of those creatures experience what we would describe as emotions. Now, these are instinctive or intuitive states of mind that they're really symptoms of a complex cognitive function, right? We talked about cognition and learning and operant conditioning and how we're rewarded to doing things. That's really the tools that we need to start developing emotions. We smile because we're rewarded to doing so, right? There are a lot of theories about that, about how we're either rewarded or punished, or not punished, but deterred from presenting certain emotions in certain situations, but they all serve a function of some sort. But many or most mammals display emotional states, and humans really aren't any exception to that. We can experience anger, for example. Your book really comes up with a nice little list. I use a wheel, an emotion wheel, to ask people to describe how they feel. And right at the center of the wheel, we have our basic emotions, which are anger, joy, depression, and fear. And these states of minds are not always direct reflection of our reasoning, right? So I'm going to share my screen with you here. Got a slide presentation I'd like to take notes, but sometimes it just might be quicker for me to go through some fun little graphics, okay? So why do we feel feelings? Where do they come from? If everything about our anatomy and physiology makes some amount of sense in evolutionary context, what is the benefit of having emotions or possessing those emotions, right? What purpose do they serve in the sense of survival? So an analysis of emotional response in animals really goes all the way back to the time of Charles Darwin himself. He compared such responses in a variety of species and proposed that the expression of emotion evolved in an organism so as to signal other organisms what it was about to do next, right? We develop language. We also develop body language and gestures and responses in that very same manner. So let me give you an example. So for example, so what, as you see in this picture here, when an animal is feeling threatened, it might display a stance of aggression. It may bare its teeth. It may lean forward. It may make aggressive sounds. All of this behavior is to indicate the potential for violent behavior. What's coming next, right? It's alerting the animal, the other animal, what's coming next. And it does well in intimidating some percentage of other organisms nearby, which then might retreat in fear without necessarily actually going in combat. Now, let me ask you, I don't think we talked much about children in this class, but in my child development class, we talk about tantrums, right? If we look at that as an example of that, we see aggressive behavior usually boil up in toddlers. And why does that happen that way? Because usually somewhere along the line, they have been rewarded. They have gotten what they wanted, so they continue to throw temper tantrums. Wow, I just created a word there. But that's what Darwin really suggested with aggressive behavior. So thus, this type of behavior is quantifiable, has a quantifiable impact on the survival of the organism, and therefore becomes a preferable trait in the gene pool, according to Darwin. All right. So, so submission is the opposite of aggression, and thus is expressed in the opposite manner physically, right? With the, as you can see, maybe in a dog, especially with a downward posture, an aversion of gaze of their eyes, and other behaviors that communicate a lack of physical threat. This can also serve a survival purpose in reducing the chances of confrontation, of violent confrontation. So emotional states, what they really catalyze these behaviors, and this is the context in which we understand how emotions have evolved in animals. Okay, so how does it work in the brain? We talked extensively about how memories form and how learning occurs, but how does emotion occur in the brain? Okay, the first theory that really attempted to explain this was the James Lange theory in the late 19th century, and this states that the sensory stimuli are received in the cortex in the brain, and then in turn activate both the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system, right? Your motion and your automatic reflexes, right? And these responses in turn trigger an experience of emotion in the brain. This means that physiological states create emotion, according to the James Lange theory of emotion, okay? So this was kind of opposite of common sense. This is a little bit different than what we would really think of ourselves, right? We would think that we see something and our brain tells us it's happening, and then we would, and then based on that emotion, we would produce the physical response. Nonetheless, the theory maintained that autonomic activity, like change in heart rate and other involuntary responses, that trigger that emotional state, okay? So whereas common sense really suggests that we perceive danger like a bear, I think I've used this example in the past. One would feel that, say we're walking in the woods and we see a bear. Our response, we're aware of what our response is. Our heart rate goes up, where we start tensing, we might even freeze, right? Those are all normal experiences that many of us would probably feel. But our common sense would tell us that our mind is controlling our actions. But again, according to James Lange, it's our physical response that triggers our brain to think that we're having those emotions. Okay. So a bit later, there were a lot of holes in that theory, and the Cannon-Bard kind of expressed that. Like, for example, one of the criticisms that Cannon-Bard had is that it really takes too much time for our body to ramp up and then our mind to kind of be aware of what's happening. So Cannon-Bard suggested that instead of the stimuli triggering both the physical expression of emotion and the emotion state itself, it happens as a parallel. Okay, so they both happen simultaneously. So a bear would trigger both the physical and the emotional response simultaneously and independently. Okay. So two things happen at once. And however, as your book pointed out, there are more modern studies that have shown that neither of these models can be totally accurate, and it would seem that perception, the experience of emotion, and physical response, they can all really influence one another, which this diagram is kind of showing. So they all interchange with each other, and more of a cognitive process goes on than what the other two theories produced. Now, it's important to keep in mind that these are theories, right? We don't have little wire tracers within our brain to tell us exactly what's happening when. We have a good idea with functional MRI and PET scans and CAT scans, but for the most part, we're kind of left to what we believe happens, and that's based on these theories, okay? So there are multiple theories of emotion, the experience of emotion, and these are just some of them, all right? So another important theory relates to the limbic system. And this is comprised of the amygdala, the hippocampus, the cortex of cingulate gyrus, the olfactory bulb, the hypothalamus, right? And this theory proposes that emotional states are expressed when these structures act on the hypothalamus, and then they're experienced through their action on the cortex, right? So surprisingly, certain aspects of emotional response are consistent across not just humans, but every other primate species. An example is facial expressions here. As you can see, we have the chimpanzee, which is very closely related DNA and anatomically to humans. Probably, I think most people say they're our closest cousin to than any other being on the face of the planet. But they show similar emotions, as you can see here. And they usually mean very similar things. So it's not just facial expressions in humans. We do possess that, but we are also seeing that in certain other animals as well, right? So it was proposed that there are 6 primary expressions that correlate with anger, disgust, fear, happiness, sadness, and surprise. And that any other expression is some mixture thereof. So we may have little micro expressions that might show that we're feeling guilt or something like that, right? Or there might be a level of intensity. Somebody might be, they might bring up their eyebrow when they're shocked about something, but they might make an even more intense face if they're surprised about something even greater, if it's more intense, right? So the facial feedback hypothesis, I'm skipping one here. The facial feedback hypothesis even proposes that simply enacting a particular facial expression can influence the onset of corresponding emotion. And there exists some evidence to support this. One of the things I like to do with my live classes, and this is an experiment that has been done countless times and probably more classes than mine. But I give my class a comic strip. Everybody in the class views a comic strip, and they take their own pencil or pen or whatever, and I have half the class put it between their teeth, emulating a smile, right? If you think about it, you put it in your teeth, you're emulating a smile. And then the other half of the class puts the pen and the bridge of their nose and their upper lip and kind of produce a frowny face. And then I asked them to rate the comic strip as to how funny they think that is on a scale of 1 to 10. And normally what happens, and this happens really throughout, is the people that have it in their teeth self-report that comic being funnier on average than the people that have it above their mouth and producing a frowny face. So that tells us that even making certain gestures will trigger our mind to think a little bit differently, right? So when it comes to researching, comes to studying emotions, most of the research, as you probably have already seen in your book, or if you're doing your group projects on this, it focuses on fear. This is the emotional reaction to any kind of immediate threat. And really, it's the easiest emotion to study because it's simple to infer from behavior of many species. I mean, we see it throughout any species when they're exhibiting fear or even anger for that matter, right? So fear tends to produce either defensive behaviors, and they're meant to protect an organism from harm, or aggressive behaviors, which are meant to threaten or harm the threat itself, kind of a reaction to it, right? And these are instinctual behaviors, and they've evolved for survival purposes, as you can imagine. And they take on various forms in different species, and they often obey a target site receptor. Now, I'm sorry, target site concept. So what does that mean? This means that the behaviors are meant to attack specific places on a threatening organism while protecting certain vulnerable areas of its own body. I think I shared with you, when we feel fear, when we experience fear or some kind of aggression, the first thing that we do is we tense up our muscles, right? We tense up our muscles. And that's thought because we are protecting our neck from sustaining any, we're aware, we have our spine back there, we have our jugular. A lot of life-sustaining functions go through our neck, and us shrugging our shoulders and our neck is really designed to protect ourselves. Okay, so there's a reason for that. All right, so as far as aggressive behaviors, they're really meant to attack. They're meant to not attack. They're meant to be predatory. Some of them, right, for eating, or they could be social, as to establish or maintain social hierarchy, typically among males, right? Hence the so-called alpha male that exists in communities of certain animals, especially dogs. We see that happen in dogs. I like to think that we've evolved as humans so that we don't engage in alpha male behavior, but you know, I think evidence suggests otherwise. We also have defensive behaviors, and these are a little bit more varied. They can be intraspecific, defending against social aggression. The freeze and flight involves staying perfectly still when a threat is perceived until a certain safety zone is penetrated, and at which point the organism will attempt to flee rapidly. All right. All right. So if you think about what I'd like you to kind of break away here and think about is how this affects us mental health wise. What does this mean, mental health? What happens in defensive behaviors? And I'm going to give you an example. Let's say that you have a critical final exam that's due. How many of you feel anxious when you have to take an exam?
Me.
Me.
A couple of you? I would say a vast majority, including myself. I also endure anxiety when it comes to something really important. You know, when I have to take my counselor's exam, you know, that brings up anxiety for me because, you know, there's a lot on the line for that. But we experience that fight or flight even in something that really isn't that threatening to us, like an exam. So why is that? And when we get into mental health, we're going to talk about rational fears and irrational fears, because rational fears are things that are actual threats out there. Like if we're walking along, we see a bear in the woods, it makes sense that we're afraid of that because that's a real threat. So why do we have that same reaction when we have to take a major exam, or if we have to do a presentation like many of you are going to be doing here in a couple weeks, right? So something for you to think about when we get into rational and irrational fears with mental health here in a couple weeks, okay? All right, sorry. So also, likewise, and humans as well, engage in risk management. We scan the environment defensively. Some people burrow into a ground and hide, right? Not literally, but you think about that. When somebody's enduring severe anxiety and depression, what do they tend to do, like in the mornings? Are they harder to get out of bed? Do they want to kind of just maybe you know, maybe there's some days that I don't want to get out of bed. That might look like burrowing or hiding, right? Avoiding that conflict or stressful situation. Okay. So, and of course, There are maternal defenses as well. So any of you that have encountered like a deer or a bear in the woods, right? They instinctively protect their young. And at times in such a violent manner, it really resembles male social aggression, right? Social aggression is most species that it's exhibited very prominently in males, typically much more than females, with the exception of aggression like we saw in the previous slide with a mother protecting her young. This is really because the period in which testosterone is released in males, usually around birth, seems to have an effect on an organism on the person's nervous system, which is reinforced further testosterone release, usually at the time of puberty. So that's why if any of you have gone through, a really turbulent adolescence going through puberty, some males might be a little bit more moody, right? We see that. Females are moody as well, and that's because hormones are released. But specifically to social aggression, we're looking at testosterone as being the implicator in producing those aggressive tendencies. Okay. However, the correlation between testosterone and aggression is still being studied and is far more conclusive. Like right now, we understand as humans that we're able to make different choices instead of being aggressive, instead of bullying, instead of going to be that alpha male or that defensive mother, right? We're understanding that even though the hormones are there, we're able to make a conscious effort to make different choices with that. So a lot of studies are looking at why that is. Why are some animals less able to control their behaviors when, for example, we as humans can? All right. Our understanding of fear on really is at a mechanical level is quite a bit more sound due again to studies utilizing fear, what we looked at as rats, which is the establishment of fear in response to what should be a neutral stimulus. Sounds familiar, right? Classical conditioning. That's exactly what this is, which we learned about before, and we discussed memory and learning, how that impacts emotions, especially when we're looking at fear conditioning. Okay. An example in this context would be the production, if we produced an auditory tone just before an electric shock is administered. The rat eventually responds to the tone itself with the variety of defensive behaviors and nervous system responses. So again, we pair up, if you remember, the neutral stimulus, which is the bell, and then the unconditioned stimulus, which is the shock. We pair those together, and now we can create a fear response, similar to what we saw when we were talking about on classical conditioning, right? Now, what's interesting about this, and Hans Sele did a lot of good studies, and we're going to talk more about this when we get into depression especially, is learned helplessness. And that occurs when an organism like an animal or person can't escape whatever it is, that adverse effect that they're feeling. And what we're now learning, we used to think that led to depression. And with recent studies, and again, I will cover this a little bit later, what we are starting to realize is that learned helplessness is probably not more or less doesn't contribute any more to depression than anything else, really. So in fact, it offers resilience to the individual or the organism if they're able to overcome whatever that stressful situation is. So really cool stuff on that. And that's a recent development, because we used to pair that. If somebody is in a negative situation for so long and they start feeling hopeless, we used to think that just kept getting worse and worse and worse. And we're finding that really induces resilience in some people. And it's not foolproof. It's some people develop resilience out of it, and some people stay depressed, or they even get even worse, fall into deeper depression, or even worse, suicidality, having suicidal thoughts. So anyway, that was one of the examples. And Hans Sele, like I said, hopefully I'll be able to explain that here when we get into mental health. All right, so neural mechanisms that produce these responses, they can really be mapped through studies involving, do lesions. We create lesions in the brain to see if we can alter their fear response. And what we found is right around the medial geniculate nucleus, that's right around the amygdala. Once we affect that area, we kind of see a lessened response to fear, right? Now, why is that a bad thing? Now, wouldn't it be great if we didn't have any fear to anything? Fear serves a purpose. Fear protects us, right? So while it may be, this kind of takes me back to my high school days. I don't know if they still do this or not, but they used to, like friends would spook you. And if you flinched, they would nail you on the arm because you flinched, right? Some kind of rule. I don't know what it was. Got me every time, all right? My fear response is through the roof, right? So I'm easily spooked, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. As an evolutionary psychologist would say, that's actually a good thing. That permits survival. And what we see is people that have less fear probably aren't aware of danger, or they don't heed the danger and react to it in an appropriate manner, to where they may not be able to reproduce. Therefore, that gene doesn't get passed on, right? So anyway, I'm going to I know I'm coming up on time here. So just be aware that it's really in the amygdala, the structure in the amygdala that produces these fear responses and sends hormones and adrenaline and endorphins throughout the body, okay? All right. All right. So from the standpoint of cognitive neuroscience, there's really a lot of work to be done understanding the brain mechanism and the human emotion. All right. We're just really, again, infants. This is in its infantile state of our understanding of how exactly emotions form and how they change over time. When we get into personality, we'll talk about how emotions and personality really interact with each other. But it appears that the brain activity associated with each individual emotion is not really highly localized, but rather diffuse. So there's really not one area of the brain. It's all over the brain based on the emotion. And there's some really cool studies that show if we see somebody else expressing an emotion, our brain lights up similar to as we would be experiencing that same emotion as we're perceiving with somebody else, right? Which is, it's really important stuff. But from the standpoint of cognitive neuroscience, there's really a lot of work to be done. Each emotion, or even the experience of empathy, as I stated, is accompanied by activity in the motor cortex and the sensory cortex. So that means we act as we're thinking about it, okay? And this is kind of similar to what I talked about, is brain image. They're showing similar patterns enacted if a person is experiencing emotion or imagines the emotion or observes somebody else having that emotion. All right. So let's talk about stress. Let's wrap this up with talk about stress. When the body is exposed to excessive harm or threat of harm, it initiates a physiological change known as a stress response. And if you remember back to when we were talking about parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system, right? That's the area of our autonomic nervous system that activates in response to stress. And that could be a good thing, all right? There are adaptive changes in response to stresses that are beneficial for the short term, right? It activates our immune system. It boosts our heart rates. It gives us that energy that we might need to get through something, right? Stress, our response to stress can be normal, but eventually, if we see long-term exposure to stress, that can have an adverse effect on ourselves or on the individual, right? And that's mostly because it wears down the immune system after time. People that endure a lot of stress are probably not eating well, right? Because when we endure stress, our appetite isn't as good as it usually is. We could experience, if our heart's beating fast all the time and we're always anxious, that could lead to heart problems, right? So a lot of things happen when we are exposed to long-term stress, right? These are adaptive changes in response to stressors, and they're beneficial for the short term, but have adverse effect long term. The response is really centered around the pituitary and adrenal cortex. And just be familiar with HPA axis. I think that came up in your quiz. But stressors stimulate the release of these hormones from the pituitary, and it triggers the release of other uh, cortisol in the adrenal cortex, and signals molecules to produce many of the physiological effects of stress response that we know. And I'm not going to go too much into detail. I think your book did a pretty good job summing this up, but it just shows how the release of epinephrine and norepinephrine into the bloodstream just carries throughout and increases your heart rate, dilation of your lungs, creates high blood pressure, get you through whatever that stressor is. And again, short term, this is not bad, but long term, it's not good. Okay. All right. All right. So in regards to stress response, they're very complex and they vary from person to person. But we do know that certain common psychological stressors relating to jobs, relationships, and other social obligations can have effects that are similar to physical stresses, right? In fact, studies have shown, any of you that are about to present or have presented, you can probably attest to this. The studies have shown that social evaluative threat, which represents a context in which the self could be judged negatively by others, is the most reliable stimulus for inducing HPA, inducing those stress hormones, right? It makes sense given the evolutionary importance of close relationships. We like to feel good about ourselves. We want other people to feel good about ourselves. We are social beings. So if we think that we're being judged in any way, negatively, and that we feel like that's going to jeopardize our social status or our ability to stay in a relationship, that creates a high level amount of stress, right? And as I alluded to earlier, excessive amounts of stress, they can result in certain disorders such as ulcers, which are lesions in the stomach. They can be very painfully, they can be very painful due to the high acidity within that stomach. We can have, I mentioned earlier, stress can have an impact on the immune function. And, again, brief stress can improve our immune function, while chronic stress can have an adverse effect on it, okay? The mechanisms by which this occurs are really not well understood. All right, we're still scratching the surface on this, but it seems clear that the two systems that are implicated in this are the T cells and the B cells. All right, not going to really go too much into that, but just understanding, and when we get into talking about therapy and ways to overcome stressful situations, that's going to be important, okay? Because having that conversation and alerting our clients or our patients or whoever you're going to be work with, or our students, just letting them know what the long-term impact of stress we could see a little bit of shift in motivation for them to do things a little bit better. Because who wants to be sick all the time? Who wants to have health problems all the time? So it's important to kind of share that with them and let them know what they're doing. And this kind of leads me to kind of a conversation with you. What do you do to reduce your stress? What are some ways that once you recognize stress, and that's part of the therapeutic process, right? Is helping somebody to identify what those triggers to those reactions are and what to do to combat them. And it's not always easy, right? We always have this go-to. If somebody cuts us off in the car, our first go-to, we want to go maybe beat the pulp out of them, right? Or run them off the road or flip them the bird or something. That's what our instinct is usually. And some people have a hard time regulating those behaviors. So I guess what I'm asking is, what are some strategies you use to combat stress? What do you do to recognize it and reduce it? Anybody care to share?
Someone actually asked this question on Packback yesterday.
Yeah, and what was the answer to that?
One way that I try to reduce stress is like I'll take a minute to just like stop and think, or I'll meditate, or I'll even do yoga and incorporate some breathing techniques just to like calm my brain down and just like get to the root of my problems and figure out what's stressing me out.
Okay. Those are really good strategies, and I'm glad you brought that up, because one of the things that I work with, and it's right off the bat whether I'm working with children or if I'm working with patients, I teach them how to get that mind-body connection going again. Because what happens, like we saw with the James Lange theory, that's still a theory that's widely used. We still consider that a viable theory, and part of the breathing helps with that. And there's a lot of evidence that shows that it works, because when our body starts tensing up and our heart rate goes up and our breathing becomes labored and we're super hyper vigilant, right? All those things happen because we're perceiving something to be fearful or something to be stressful for us. And we can't do a whole lot about our heart rate, and we can't really do a whole lot about our the adrenaline running through our body. What we can control are two things, and that's our muscle tension and breathing. So one of the things I work with people with, and I don't have a whole lot of time to do this with this class. If we had a few more minutes, I would. But incorporating breathing like Janaya, did I pronounce that correctly?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Like Janaya pointed out, is starting to relax your body, relax your mind. That's kind of the idea behind it. So what I have people do is I have them breathe for 3 seconds in, hold it like a duration of through their nose for 3 seconds. They hold it for 2 to 3 seconds, and then they breathe out through their mouth for 3 seconds. And what they're doing is, while we're counting, you can't be stressed and count at the same time. I don't know if you knew that, but if you're counting, that distracts your mind. You're engaged in a cognitive process, and you don't have time. If that's directing your energy, you don't have time to be mad and count at the same time. All right. I don't know if you knew that, but very, very useful function. So you're distracting your mind. You're focusing on breathing. You're getting oxygen into your blood, into your lungs, and then throughout your body, and then to your mind. Right. So that sharpens your thinking. You're also telling your mind that I'm breathing normally. Things must be okay. And then within a couple minutes, we'll see a decrease in heart rate. We'll see a decrease in muscle tension, and the pupils will not be dilated anymore. They'll go back to normal, and things just start simmering. The parasympathetic nervous system kicks in. And likewise, breathing is fun. I also incorporate a little bit of guided imagery, like breathing in like a negative, bringing in a positive color, like have them pick a favorite color. Some people pick calm as like blue or green, and then red or orange might be a negative one, but they breathe in the cool, calm air, the positive energy, let it scoop up all their worries and fears, and then they release it out into the world as red or orange or whatever color they pick. That's super helpful. I also work with them while they're doing this on paying attention to where those stressors are in their neck and in their shoulders, and just having them relax their shoulders and move around their neck a little bit loosens up those neck muscles. A lot of people that report that they have a high level of stress also report that they have headaches. And it usually comes from tension headaches, which happens at the base of your neck, at the base of your brain, where those muscles tense up, right? We do that for protection from fear responses. When we tense up those muscles, we're constricting a lot of our blood flow that gets to our brain. We're kind of putting tension on our spine, at the base of our spine there, which might be affecting some neurotransmitters, some neurological stuff that signals that are going to and from our brain. So that's where the tension headaches come from. So pay attention to that. If you experience, or if you have somebody else that experiences tension headaches from stress, having them move their neck around and their shoulders, relaxing their shoulders to ease that tension. And then once you get that breathing and that muscle tension down, your mind starts to quiet itself, and you experience relaxation, which is a temporary relief. It doesn't cure if people are having financial problems, it doesn't fix those, and those will eventually have to be addressed. But in the temporary, in the meantime, it usually helps with as a positive impact on those areas. Okay. Any questions? Anybody have anything they would like to add? Was this interesting? Was it helpful?
Very.
It was very helpful.
Very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. And give that a try. Many of you that haven't engaged, I know it sounds like a lot of hooey with, I think yoga is a wonderful thing because it promotes that muscle relaxation and all good things. But give that a try. If you're experiencing stress or if you're in a conflict with somebody you care about or somebody you don't care about, try breathing. Just get those senses down and see how that works for you. Most people find it very effective. All right. So I'm going to stop recording here